Okay, we should definitely be able to wrap up this chapter with this podcast. You know, 5 is a good round number, so this is the 5th podcast. Scope rules, the last of these 7 that we wanted to look at. Scope rules affect a known outcome variable that must not, or may be affected as a result of actions taken within the situation. So there are boundary rules, position rules, information rules, and aggregation rules. Positions, players, action, situation, but there is always an outcome that is kind of an overarching thing. So scope rules focus on that. For example, for a professor to get tenure, they are evaluated on different outcome measures: quantity and quality of publications and quality of teaching, number of PhD students, grants, etc. The performance of schools can be evaluated based on many different outcomes, as witnessed by the various criteria used for college rankings. Most sports are straightforward in the outcome evaluation. One wins a competition or not. But there can be many players who decide together the outcome. So each position player has rules and information and must play towards the outcome. Some sports are based on evaluations by a jury, such as gymnastics, who follow a detailed set of rules to define the score. So that's figure 10.4, which I hope it's a bit later. I'll come back to that. An example of the application of such a scope rule would be as follows. In order for a female competitor to win, in order for a female competitor to win a sanctioned gymnastics competition, a particular outcome of an action situation, right? The gymnastic competition is a particular, I don't know why I totally mucked this up. An example of the application of such a scope rule would be as follows. In order for a female competitor to win a sanctioned gymnastic competition, which is a particular outcome of an action situation, the competitor must achieve the highest combined score on all events: the floor exercise, vault, uneven bars, and balance beam. Of course, in the real world, you have somebody who can win a gold in each. A separate person may win a gold in each event, and the overall score and the overall win may go to a different person, but the person must have, the maximum score when combined, and so on. So equating achieving the highest combined score on all events with win is a scope rule that defines how actions led to outcomes. Another set of detailed scope rules defines how judges assign points to the actions of participants. Note that both gymnasts and judges hold positions in the action situation. There are coaches as well. What are the boundary rules for them to occupy those positions? Right? The coach has to be qualified, appointed by the governing body. The gymnastics has a national association which determines all those things. Coaches are interviewed, their record is looked at, and they qualify to be the coach, and then they are given a salary. Then they train the gymnasts, and then gymnasts go and perform in front of the judges, and so on. What are the boundary rules for them to occupy those positions? To participate in the competition as a gymnast, you have to compete with other gymnasts to get selected to be on the team to participate in the competition. So all kinds of rules exist, as we already know. Another example of a scope rule used to manage fishing by Native Americans on the Northwest Pacific coast is that tribe members cannot begin fishing for a salmon until the chief has caught and dried the first salmon caught that season. So you can imagine how many days it takes for the salmon to dry, but probably it was set up for some reason to allow enough salmon to be spawned and grown to adulthood before everybody starts fishing, and so on. Okay, so here is the figure of a gymnast. Is this a good stag leap? Scope rules determine the criteria so judges can answer this question consistently. You always wonder, you look at different gymnasts being compared for these artistic presentations. So there is technical difficulties of the particular exercise they do, whether it's on the vault, on the parallel bars, or the floor, and so on. And they are all doing very interesting and very amazing looking things, and yet there are small deductions, there are small additions, and the totals are added up. That's why you have multiple judges, so that you take the average of the multiple judges, since some subjectivity obviously is involved within these rules as well. So let's look at finally the default conditions in which these rules are being applied. Not all possible actions and outcomes of each action situation have rules associated with them. If there were, following the rules would become such a complex task that we would waste all of our time on monitoring and sanctioning the rules and would get nothing done. This raises the question of what are the default situations when there are no explicit rules, and what is allowed in those circumstances. To answer this question, we can start defining the default conditions from what is physically possible. Table 10.2 below defines the default conditions for each of the rule types if there are no explicit rules. If the participants adopt internal norms that promote cooperative behavior, such a default position may lead to a positive outcome. However, if some participants cheat, manipulate, or do not cooperate, it becomes clear that explicit rules would be needed to reach a positive outcome in the action situation. How do people create rules when they experience a default situation that produces undesirable outcomes? This is always something that the system must allow, to deal with undesirable outcomes, and rules to be flexible enough to be modified to change the undesirable outcome. A possible action is to create the position of a leader or a group of leaders who coordinate communication and mediate differences in interests among the participants. So this is about stakeholder engagement and their agency in making the rules, changing the rules, navigating the outcome to be desirable. Okay, so default positions of each type of rule. Default position conditions, one position exists. Default boundary condition, anyone can hold this position, that one position that exists. Default choice condition is that each player can take any physically possible action, and then you add conditions as to what goes beyond default. Default aggregation condition, players act independently. Physical relationships present in the situation determine the aggregation of individual moves into outcomes, right? Default information condition, each player can communicate any information via any channel available to the player. Default payoff condition would be any player can retain payoffs from any outcome that the player can physically obtain and defend. Default scope condition would be each player can affect any state of the world that is physically possible. Of course, we never have this play out in any situation where everything is default. Each one begins to have qualifications and, boundary rules, position rules, information rules, aggregate rules, and so on and scope rules, of course, govern the whole situation in terms of outcome. So finally, to wrap up really this time, critical reflections. Within action situations, we can distinguish different types of rules that define who is part of the action situation, the position she can take, the information that is available to her, and what the payoffs are for different decisions. So each decision is going to have a payoff, and you are obviously playing towards that payoff within the rules that you have to follow for your position with the information that you have that comes with the position. Defining the different types of rules that provide the software for action situations is important if we wish to analyze them in more detail. So this is why we need to have this framework of rules, and the institutional analysis and development allows you to then analyze these in more details obviously to sustain the commons and have the triumph of the commons, right? So you can think for yourself, what kind of rules do you have within your household or student dorm? You came from a house, now you are living home, you are living in a dorm, you had certain rules you had to follow at home, you have a different set of rules in the dorm, and so on. Are there position rules, choice rules, boundary rules, scope rules? Of course there are, but you don't necessarily think of them in those kind of settings, but now you can. What is an example of information rule that holds for students at Arizona State University, where the authors come from? Okay, obviously each university tends to have different information rules, and those may have historical background, historical context, or context based on university's philosophy about what outcome it desires for its graduates, how it sees inclusivity and diversity in its reputation, ranking, attracting good students, and so on, etc., etc. Okay, so let's finally leave this here, and then we'll come back and look at the next chapter within the set of rules that we are looking at in this section. Okay.